Greetings and welcome to our 5th unit of the year on ratios and proportions, beginning tonight with lesson 5.1, page 164, ladies and gentlemen. And we are going to determine rates from words, tables, and graphs. Ladies and gentlemen, our essential question: how do rates help you describe real-life problems? Now, before we move on, ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk about our unit, ratios and proportions, because I've been telling you, and I've never lied to you, about what we've been doing and how it relates to what we do going forward. And when it comes to proportions, proportions can be used to solve a mass variety of mathematical problems that we are going to encounter in the future. So you really want to pay attention when we get to our proportions lessons, the next 2 lessons. Today, however, before we get to a proportion, we have to understand what we call ratios, rates, and unit rates. And just speaking of such, you were asked to take some notes from the top of page 164 on ratios, rates, and unit rates. And I hope you did so, because that is essential to you making yourself successful, a person of character and intelligence. If you're not achieving the level of success that you want to, or if you want to even improve the level of success that you're already achieving, making some slight changes, and I know this is one of them that's very important. Taking a few notes prior to us doing the videos so that you can have an idea of what we're talking about, and it gets reinforced in your brain, and it gets simplified and understood in your brain. At least that's the goal. So I'm going to talk about ratios, rates, and unit rates from the notes that you were to take. And I'm probably going to add some things to the ratio. So when we're done with this page on ratios, you might want to pause and write it all down. Very important to listen first, though. So ratios. What are ratios? Ratios is a comparison of 2 quantities by division. We compare 2 quantities by division, ladies and gentlemen, and ratios compare using the same units. It doesn't say that in the book, but that's what is implied, and that is what is meant. Ratios compare using the same units. Now, ratios can be written 3 different ways. This, again, it's written in your book, but it doesn't specify that they can be written this way. The first way being a fraction, so I can say 2 to 3, and I can write it as a fraction. The other way is a colon, and again, I would say 2 to 3, but I would write it using a colon in between the 2 numbers like that. And the third way is the word way, and that's the way I say it. I've been saying it to you, 2 to 3. Make sense? Those are the 3 ways that we write it. Now I am going to circle this one right here, the fractional way, because the fractional way is the way we write them when we want to do math. It makes it so much easier to do math when you write ratios in the fractional form. Now, ladies and gentlemen, since we can write it in fractional form, it has many qualities of fractions. They can be simplified, just like a fraction. However, they can have decimals and fractions in the numerator and the denominator of this ratio. In other words, I could say 2.3 to 1/2. That is a ratio. You're allowed to have decimals and fractions in the numerator and denominator of ratios, but not fractions. However, you can simplify these ratios just like you do fractions. Let's continue on with fractions. They're written like fractions to do math. We just said that. They act like fractions in many ways, and that you can have decimals in the numerator and or the denominator. I said all that. You might want to write some of it down now before we go on to rates. Let's talk about rates. A rate is a comparison of 2 quantities with different units. Different units. And of course, rates can be written the same 3 ways that we write ratios. Why? Because a rate is a ratio, which means any rate has all the same qualities of a ratio with one small difference. We use different units. So an example of that might be we might have 120 miles to 20 gallons. All right, makes sense? All righty, so our units would be miles to gallons on that. And of course, I could write it using a colon. I could write it using words. And our last one, unit rate. Well, we have a unit rate. And what is a unit rate? A unit rate is a rate. And it's a rate with a denominator of 1. So, in other words, a unit rate is a rate, and a rate is a ratio. So a unit rate is a ratio, a comparison of two numbers by division, which can be written in the 3 different forms. And it's a rate, which means it has different units. But now it's called a unit rate because it has a denominator of 1. In other words, if I take our rate of 120 miles over 20 gallons, and I turn this into a unit rate, it has to be out of 1 gallon. So I would simplify this rate, 120 miles over 20 gallons, and I would say 6 miles to 1 gallon. And this would be a unit rate with a denominator of 1 right there. Unit rates have a denominator of 1. So ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start off this first video with our examples on writing ratios. Ratios being of the same units. So scoops of raisins to scoops of peanuts, and you might think they're different because raisins and peanuts are different, but we're actually talking scoops to scoops. And it says a popular brand of trail mix contains 2 scoops of raisins and 5 scoops of peanuts. So in number 1, we're going to do a ratio of scoops of raisins to scoops of peanuts. And we can see right up here, 2 scoops of raisins and 5 scoops of peanuts. So I can say 2 to 5. And I can write it all 3 ways. Depending on what is asked of you in your practice, most of the time, of course, we're going to write it as a fraction. Number 2, scoops of raisins to the total scoops. So once again, we have 2 scoops of raisins, and the total number of scoops now would be 7, because raisins and peanuts added together is 7 scoops. So I can write that in all 3 forms as well. Oops, I almost wrote that. In fact, I did write that wrong. Let's write it correctly this time. So 2 to 7, 2 to 7, and 2 to 7. Example number 3, scoops of peanuts to total scoops. This time we're going to the peanuts, and there are 5 scoops of peanuts in this trail mix to the 7 total scoops that are in there. And of course, we can write this in all 3 forms as well. Pretty straightforward on writing ratios. We're going to now use something different. 16 pepperoni pizzas out of 24 pizzas. So 16 out of 24. And of course, we talked about it. These ratios act like fractions. So now we're seeing that 16 out of 24, that can be simplified. So I can simplify this. Both of them are divisible by 8. So my new ratio would be 2 out of 3 as my ratio of pepperoni pizzas to 24 pizzas. 2 out of every 3 pizzas are pepperoni. 12 minutes to 2 hours. Now here's a new one. And the problem with this new one is we don't have the units that we need to write a ratio. We said we have to have the same units. So I'm going to actually convert the 2 hours to minutes, because we would have nasty looking decimals if we converted the minutes to hours, and then it wouldn't make as much sense. We could do it, but I'm not going to. So I know 2 hours is 120 minutes because there are 60 minutes in an hour, and when I multiply those together, I get 120 minutes. So now I can write my ratio of 12 minutes to 120 minutes, and I can simplify that by dividing by 12. And my final ratio would be 1 to 10. 1 minute to 10 minutes. And our last one, 1 foot to 3 inches. Again, I want to make the same units to write my ratio. And it's easier to convert the bigger one to the smaller one so that we can eliminate the decimals if we want, if we can, only because it's more difficult to understand ratios when they have fractions and decimals in the numerator and the denominator, or in the ratio period. It can be done because they are ratios, but we'd rather not. So 1 foot is 12 inches. So now I have 12 over 3, which again can be simplified by dividing by 3. And I would get 4 over 1. 4 inch to 1 inch, which, as we understand, if I know that there's a 1 in the denominator, this is also a unit rate simply because it has 1 in the denominator. But right now it's a ratio because they're all the same units. It is both. Ladies and gentlemen, that ends the first video. Let's go to our quick write. Go ahead and write these down. You just need to write these right here, word for word, write them down, and then write the ratio. Please write the ratio in all 3 forms. All 3 forms for each one. Got it? Write them all in all 3 forms. Take a quick break. Come back and see me for video number 2 of 3 tonight. We do have 3 tonight.